evening, everyone. Welcome to the Caribbean Cultural Center's program, Curators in Conversation, a series dedicated to critical debate, dialogue, and engagement with curators of color committed to the artistic and cultural production of the Afro-Caribbean and its diaspora. I'm Grace Aneiza Ali, the Curator-at-Large at CCCADI, as we call it, and Assistant Professor of Art and Public Policy at NYU. First and foremost, I want to thank the hardest working team, which is the team behind CCCADI, for their support in putting together this series each and every time. Kat Lazo is our magician producer behind the scenes. Thank you, Kat. And a special thank you to our leadership team at the center, Melody Capote and Regina Beltran, who always continue to find support and funding to support these initiatives for curators of color as part of CCCADI's larger mission. So I want to just always acknowledge the team at the Caribbean Cultural Center. For this month's iteration of Curators in Conversation, I am just so thrilled to have TKSmith and Jonathan Square with us and to give them this platform to talk with each other. Most of the time, the curators in this series, as in this case, are meeting each other for the first time and learning about each other's practices for the first time, which is really at the core of this public program series for CCCADI, creating opportunities for exchange and collaboration, and possibly even some curatorial friendships. You never know. So let me introduce our two curators to you. Joining me, where are you guys? Joining me, TKSmith is the inaugural. Hi, TK, there you are. TKSmith.
Howdy.
Hi, welcome.
Thank you.
I'm gonna read a short bio and brag about you a little bit, if that's okay, if you could stand it. TKSmith is the inaugural Tina Dunkley Fellow in American Art at Clark Atlanta University Art Museum and is currently a PhD candidate in the American Civilization program at the University of Delaware. I know you're quite busy in that program, TK.
Yes.
TK's research interests lie in American art and material culture and the built environment, and he most recently curated Looming Chaos, such a beautiful, provocative title, Looming Chaos at the Zuckerman Museum of Art. I have to tell the audience that I first encountered TK's work, not actually via one of his exhibitions, but through his writing. And TK penned a most thoughtful and provocative essay on the 2019 exhibition of the Jamaican-American artist Cosmo White at Mocha, Georgia in Atlanta. And in this essay, TK is interrogating the experiences of the Caribbean immigrant who now finds themselves an American citizen. And so I just wanted to share with you this brief couple of lines that really struck me from TK's essay. Yes. TK writes, as he's interrogating this question of immigrant and citizenship, particularly for the Caribbean person, TK writes, what is the notion of home to an expatriate? What is the notion of nation to the colonized? Is sugarcane still sweet to those enslaved to harvest it? I read that and I said, I need to have you here in conversation with us. So welcome, TK. Thank you for joining.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And we're also just so thrilled to have Jonathan Square with us. Hi, Jonathan. Welcome.
Hello.
Jonathan is curator and an historian in Afro-Diasporic fashion and art of the 18th and 19th centuries. He's the founder of this wonderful digital humanities project titled Fashioning the Self in Slavery and Freedom, a curated platform that explores intersections between slavery and the fashion system. And Jonathan, it's really compelling and important work in that humanities project. I really, really love what you're doing there.
Thank you.
And in tandem, his current book is The Fabric of Our Lives, How Slavery Built the Global Fashion Industry. And I hope we get to hear a little bit more about that in our conversation with you. Jonathan, one of the things I have to say I was drawn to about your work, as we're both teachers, is the ways in which you blend your curatorial practice with your teaching philosophy. So in doing my research, I know as a Harvard faculty member, you have this course titled Black Visuality in the Digital Age. And I'm sure there's a waiting list for that course. If there's not, there ought to be a waiting list for this course. So to our audience watching, we'll start with a brief opening talk from TK and Jonathan, and they'll each show a few slides just to give us a teaser of what their curatorial practices are about. And then they'll delve into their conversation with each other on some of their shared concerns and intersecting ideas within each of their respective curatorial practices. And some of that might include both historical and contemporary movements towards racial justice. They're both interested in Black visual and material culture, and their commitment to making curatorial research and scholarship more accessible in and outside of academia, something I'm always ranting about and an issue very close to my heart. So I was so happy to see both of you invested in that as well. And so those of you watching, please do send us in your questions and your comments. We can see them as they come in, and we'll be addressing them later on in the Q&A portion of the program. And so now I will turn our digital room over to TK, and he will share some slides of his work.
Well, howdy, everybody. I am so thankful to be invited here to speak with y'all today. It's really interesting to have a conversation about my curatorial practice because I'm emerging, so it's constantly in flux. I don't have a strong history to reference, but I will tell you how I got into curating and kind of how it found me. So I worked in libraries for a really long time. I worked in Ferguson's Public Library in Ferguson, Missouri. I went to SLU in St. Louis and ended up working full-time for SLU's academic library. And I fell in love with that process of connecting people to knowledge. I fell in love with that process of handing somebody a book and talking about that book and talking about books we haven't read and people sharing books with me. It's kind of where I fell in love with like public service and public work. And I'm kind of nerdy, so it's just fun to share knowledge and information with people. And, you know, as you get higher in your education, you start asking more and more critical, more and more nuanced questions. And so the library is kind of rose up with me in that by the time I had finished my master's, I was working in an academic library. And I thought I was going to be a librarian for a really long time, but then I got an internship at the Contemporary Art Museum in St. Louis. And they don't have a collection and they're free. And so I'm spoiled in thinking that all museums should be as flexible as museums without collections, and they should all be free. That's something a lot of people from St. Louis can relate to because there's a tax that makes a lot of the institutions free. But yeah, I interned there under a curator who named Kelly Schindler. And it was just a steep learning curve. That the quality of work they expected from me was much higher than I expected, but it kicked me in the right way, and that it made me even more passionate and even more excited about the work. And there's nothing like being excited for work and challenged by it. You know, it makes me kind of a workaholic, which is a problem, but we can talk about that another time. And so, yeah, I worked with Kelly Schindler, and I decided from that point on, after that really good experience, that I wanted to be an art curator. I haven't decided on contemporary art yet, but I know I'm interested in art of the Americas, and that's the greater Americas, because I'm interested in things like post-colonial identity. I'm interested in cultural retentions. I'm interested in the built environments that build up these empires, these nations after the transatlantic slave trade. And so if I could get the first slide, I'm going to use this slide to do a little promo for an exhibition that I have coming up in February. And so I was granted the opportunity, and I'm actually in the space right now, to curate the project spaces during the 2021 Atlanta Biennial at the Atlanta Contemporary in Atlanta, Georgia. And so I've decided to unify the project spaces in a small exhibition called Virtual Remains. And this exhibition came from a desire to really tap into the ephemerality of things. Ephemeral is one of my favorite words, it's one of my favorite concepts. And I wanted to talk about it in relation to technology. There are so many things we miss in conversations like this, so many things that fall in the gap of me, like I'm talking to a camera, even though it feels like I'm talking to two other folks and however many other folks are out there. But there's so much that we lose in that connectivity of being together that I feel like technology kind of falsely makes us mimics. And so all the artists I invited to be in this show, if I could get the second slide, deal with archiving technology and performance in really interesting ways. So this is Danielle Detweiler, actress, playwright, dancer, and artist. Shane Dedman, who is a poet and also an artist and a filmmaker. Adam Forrester, who's a filmmaker, and Artemis Jenkins. And they're all archivists in different ways. Artemis is interested in Black leisure and joy. He wants to document joy and has built an archive of images that he feels pushes up against that negative onslaught that we see when we turn on our TVs. And so all of these artists are kind of interrogating the archive and how we remember and what we forget in really interesting ways. And that's kind of what I'm interested in. I build my curatorial projects from questions that I have about the world. If I could get the next slide. And I really wanted to get people to think when they come into these project spaces, what am I missing? What am I missing when I don't connect with people or art in person? What am I letting go of? And what do I still need when I have that experience that is simulated through technology? This here is a still of Artemis Jenkins in his studio. This will be a similar setup. Each project space during the biennial is very interesting. They're weird spaces. And so each artist is responding to those spaces with what will be mostly original work, new work that we've commissioned for this project. So I'm really excited about it. And I'm super thankful to the Contemporary for giving me the opportunity to keep working even after my fellowship ended. If I could get the next slide. And so I got to be one of the two inaugural Tina Dunkley Curatorial Fellows at Clark Atlanta University Art Museum. It was an amazing opportunity that was created by Dr. Marita Poole and some collaborators. It was a 3-institution program. And so I got to work at Clark, but I also got to work at the Zuckerman where my show was mounted. And I also got to work at PAFA in Philadelphia. And I'm now based in Philadelphia, even though I'm in Atlanta now. So this is very confusing because I'm also in school in Delaware and I'm from Iowa. So I'm all over the place. But that fellowship was amazing in that they took me in as someone who is not an art historian, someone who just had a master's, when opportunities were very hard to find to break into the field. You know, that internship was my real first entrance into the field. And that showed me that there are lots of closed doors. Lots of closed doors. And Dr. Marita Poole actually is an anthropologist. She's from Atlanta. Her mother worked at Clark, and she understands how hard it is to break into this field and was forging opportunities for folks like me. And so I'm eternally grateful to her and Clark Atlanta University Art Museum and all of the collaborators in the creation of the Tina Dunkley Fellowship. It gave me the opportunity to curate my first show, which was titled Looming Chaos. Didn't know we'd be in so much chaos. Didn't know it was really looming like it is when I came up with the title. But if I could get the next slide. Looming Chaos was, again, me trying to answer a question about connecting to the audience at the Zuckerman are very young. It's a college museum. And I wanted to connect to young people to get them to think, and I know that's funny to say I'm kind of young, but I wanted to connect to other young people and say, what can we make of this that we've been given? And I knew I wanted to do a textile show because as someone who studies material culture, I'm extremely invested in craft. I have a bias. I love the craft of artwork. And so I ended up working with, who is illustrated here, weaver and ceramicist Zephora Camille Thompson, who's an Atlanta-based artist. We did a solo show together. If I could get the next slide. her work is fantastic. And so here are some installation shots from the show. Next slide, please. You can get a sense of the kind of work that she does. She makes fantastical, as I call them, fantastical fiber abstractions, and they're so lush and beautiful, and they're made from both found objects and art material. So you'll see hair, barrettes, photographs, you'll see dolls, stones, anything you can kind of think of. She kind of tapestries into these beautiful abstractions. And something I really love and admire about her work is she's alchemaically bringing to her loom, because she uses multiple looms, she's bringing to her loom emotion, trauma, pain, wishes, aspirations, dreams. She's bringing to it situations and transforming them along with these objects, these found objects that many people might discard or call trash, into fine art. And together we were able to put together a show of 21 of her works, 5 of which we were able to commission, one of which is site specific, if I could get the next slide. And I know these images don't do them justice, but they're so lush and so tactile, and they shimmer and they're colorful, and they're just these beautiful organic forms that might reflect like the cosmos or natural landscapes of the body. Sephora is a Southerner. She's from North Carolina, and you get a good mixed sense of all of the influences of the South, all of the influence, that connectivity to the earth. And then also her explorations in the world. She did a long extended residency in Mexico, and you start to see those ceramic practices influence her practice as you follow along. So it was just an amazing opportunity. If I could get the next slide, please. And it allowed us both to have our first catalog. My first catalog as a curator and her first catalog as an artist. And together we created this beautiful, beautiful book, full color images, and these beautiful little silver etching postcards that we hope people who purchase the book will enjoy. I wrote an essay for her. There are poems. We wanted to keep it interdisciplinary because I'm interdisciplinary. And there's a conversation between Sephora and the LA-based weaver, Deidre Brackens, who I brought them together because I think that there are things two weavers can bring out in conversation that I couldn't bring out. You know, I'm not a weaver. And that conversation was beautiful, and it's on YouTube. So if you're interested, it's called A Meditation on the Loom. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And I'm also a writer. I think that curatorial practice is very much so about writing and project managing. It's like you talk to your artists, how's the work going? Did you eat? Then you turn around and you write as much as you can. And writing for me is an extension of care, and it's an extension of attempting to connect people to the work. You know, I can put work up in a space, but I think that the writing helps give it meat for people, more to feast on. Here I have 3 examples of 3 works I've recently written. So Towards a Monumental Black Body, I wrote for Art Papers. It's an interrogation into the problematics of representing the Black body on the public visual landscape in the United States. And I start by talking about Kehinde Wiley's Rumors of War, but I go into kind of this long visual history we have of the Black body being objectified and used in the American public visual landscape. And I speculate about if we can change that in contemporary times, as the topic of monuments are so hot. And then I was able to give my first lecture as a curator for a show at the Flatton Museum at St. Olaf College called Embracing the Infinite Mother, about the photos of Chandra McCormick and Keith Calhoun that were affected by the floodwaters of Hurricane Katrina. And what happened, there are 30 years of photographs and archive that they had built together, photographing New Orleans from multiple vantage points, but mostly a loving, caring, considerate vantage point, were destroyed by the floodwaters. But the show was called We No Longer Consider Them Damaged. And so they took these photographs and they took them through the process and produced them into large prints. So you can kind of see one. It's called Mother with Child. And it's this beautiful image of a woman holding a baby on the pew of a church. And it's partially abstracted and lost in color and form. And they're just beautiful and lush images. And then, of course, like Grace so graciously mentioned, my essay for Cosmo, I was able to do a lot of work with Cosmo. Cosmo kind of circulated my life when I was living here in Atlanta in multiple ways, but his work really hit me in that show. It was the first time I got to sit in a space with only his show, only his work, only his words, and hear what he had to say about his experience as a Jamaican American, but also his experience as a product of the transatlantic slave trade, his experience as an expatriate, his experiences as a man living between these multiple, multifaceted, fragmented, sometimes identities. And I feel like that was something I could really connect to, you know, as a Black American, feeling like a Black person with no settled land. You know, I always feel kind of migrant-ish, even in the continent of the United States. And so that essay was a wonderful opportunity that he gave me to express just how much I love his work and how important I think it is. And so that's me in a nutshell. And I'd love to give it to Jonathan.
Great. Well, thank you for that. That was beautiful. And, you know, we follow each other on Instagram, and we've talked before, but actually I learned so much more about you from that conversation. And I realized that we have a lot in common. So yeah, our interests overlap in a lot of ways. So this is a perfect pairing. Thank you, Grace. And thank you, CCCADI, for giving me this opportunity to share my curatorial work with everyone. So hi, everyone. My name is Jonathan. I am a faculty member at Harvard University. And I'm also, like TK, a reluctant academic and emerging curator. And I just want to spend a few minutes just talking about some of the work that I've done. All the shows that I've curated have been on Harvard University's campus. And this was the first one that I curated. It was titled Slavery in the Hands of Harvard. And I got a grant from the university to create this exhibition. I was shocked because the topic is a little controversial. But they were fine with it, and they gave me money to curate the exhibition. It was in a space on campus that's where there's classrooms. So it wasn't a dedicated gallery art space, which is interesting for a number of reasons, because people were able to sort of engage with the work sort of on the way to a meeting, on the way to class. So I got a lot of interesting reactions for that reason. So this was the wall text for the show. Could you go to the next slide? Okay. So you can see in the background of this image, one of my favorite pieces from the show. It's by an artist named Noel W. Anderson. And he's also a textile artist. He takes archival images of Black people and weaves them, you mix them into textiles, into blankets almost, and then distresses the surface. So he actually created this piece for this show. Actually, the next slide is a closer up of it. He took Henry Louis Gates' mugshot from his arrest in 2009 and paired it with one of the Zealy daguerreotypes of a enslaved man named Renty. And, you know, I think the name sort of Renty Henry sort of work well together, but also thinking about the ways in which people of African descent have engaged with, in very fraught ways, with the University of Harvard. So Renty was photographed by a man named Joseph T. Zealy, who was commissioned by Louis Agassiz, who was a Harvard professor in the late 19th century. And he created a series of daguerreotypes of enslaved people in South Carolina. And of course, Henry Louis Gates was arrested in 2009. So he paired these two images, and I think it worked, created this diptych, and I think it works really well. And this piece is really emblematic of the entire show, because what I did in the show is I took pieces from Harvard's permanent collection, like maps, documents, photographs, and paired them with the work of contemporary artists who grapple with the legacy of slavery in some way. Okay, you can go to the next slide. So here's another example of that. I took a photo of the Sugar Baby installation. I got permission from Sakima Jenkins to use this reproduction. And I paired it with a document in Harvard's collection. It's a tuition bill from the 18th century. And this student paid for his tuition with sugar. Of course, in the 18th century, there wasn't a lot of specie, a lot of paper money or coin money, and people often paid for things through bartering. So this student, whose family owned several plantations in Jamaica, paid for his tuition with cascus sugar. So I paired a scan of that document with a reproduction of Carol Walker's Sugar Baby installation. Okay, can you go to the next slide? So I also did it. This isn't an installation photo. These are just two scans next to each other. But I paired a map that is in Harvard's permanent collection of Jamaica. And I paired it with the work of Renee Cox. And on this map, you can actually see several plantations that are owned by old Massachusetts families. I'm using air quotes because I don't want to like reproduce their ideas of like gentility. But you can see several plantations that like, you know, wealthy white people in Massachusetts owned, particularly the Royals. So that's why I chose this particular map of Jamaica. The official name of it is A New Map of Jamaica, and I paired it with the work of Renee Cox in her Queen Nanny series. So throughout the show, I did that. I took archival documents or text photographs and paired it with the work of contemporary artists. So that was Slavery in the Hands of Harvard. And a few months later, I got another grant from the university to curate another show. And I decided to do a solo show with Neal Irving Painter. And actually, could you go to the next slide? Actually, sorry, I'm going to jump back to Slavery in the Hands of Harvard. This is a work, you can go to the next slide. This is actually from Slavery in the Hands of Harvard. This is a work by a Brazilian artist named Rosana Paulino. And she actually took archival images from Louis Agassiz, the same Harvard professor who commissioned the Zelia daguerreotypes. Louis Agassiz also traveled to Brazil and documented the flora and fauna of Brazil, but also took photographs and images of native people and enslaved people in Brazil, sort of like ethnographic data that he used for his research to prove that there's a hierarchy of races, basically to prove that Black and brown people were inferior to people of European descent. And so Rosana Paulino, who's an Afro-Brazilian artist, took those images, cut them out, and put them in sort of these geometric shapes to sort of change the way we think about and sort of make them less problematic. Okay, now I can go to the next slide. So the next show that I did at Harvard was 2 solo shows of the artist Neal Irving Painter. And actually, when she's an artist, she prefers Neal Painter to Neal Irving Painter. But as a historian, she's known as Neal Irving Painter. And she was a professor of history for several decades at Princeton University and wrote several important monographs on African American history. And when she retired about 10 or 15 years ago, she actually went back to school in her 60s and got a BFA in fine arts from Rutgers. And then she went to RISD afterwards and got an MFA in fine arts. So she actually has 5 degrees. She went to college, of course, has a master's, a PhD, then a BFA and an MFA. And so now she's working as a professional artist. Yeah. And I wanted to work with her for a number of reasons. One, I'm a historian, I have a PhD in history, but I've also sort of made a turn towards the art world. And so I felt like there was a lot of commonalities between us for that reason. And I also like that she approaches art as a historian. Like she often has an argument or a research question, and she works through that argument or research question through her art. And I really like that. So I was very honored that she agreed to allow me to curate 2 shows of her art at Harvard. She's also a Harvard alum, so that's another reason why it worked well for the university. Okay, go to the next slide. So the first show, the title was Odolist Atlas, Art History is Told Through, so History is Told Through Art, sorry. I'm very proud of that the wall text because I designed it myself. Both the Slavery in the Hands of Harvard and this one I designed myself. And I curated both these exhibitions on a shoestring budget. But this series, Odolist Atlas, Neal Painter was interested in geographies of slavery and thinking about the etymology of the word slave. And she sort of mapped the Caucasus onto the Caribbean. So there's not a close-up shot, but it's basically the same map in 2 iterations. She takes the Caucasus but changes the geographical names of each of the places. So you see Haiti and Jamaica and Puerto Rico and Louisiana mapped onto places like, the Caucasus or Cyprus. And she was particularly interested in thinking about the odalisque and thinking about beauty, and sort of thinking about the origins of the word slave and sort of like doing a long history. She, of course, wrote a book called The History of White People, which she wrote before her last memoir. She wrote a memoir called Old in Art School about her experience as a person in her 60s and 70s in art school. But before she wrote Old in Art School, she wrote another book called The History of White People. So she's really interested in like getting at this history. Of course, in the book, it's more of a historical monograph. It's like a tome. It's very thick. But in this series, she was working through that idea using art. Okay, you can go to the next slide. One thing that she found, she actually went to the Caucasus, and she realized that the word Caucasian actually doesn't mean anything. Of course, here in North America, the word Caucasian means white or person of European descent. But when she went to the Caucasus, like Caucasian simply means someone who's from the Caucasus, and they have different ways of determining difference. So she's really interested in unpacking ideas of race and like not only interrogating Blackness, but also interrogating whiteness, which she did in the series. As you can see, the show was mounted also in a transitory space, a space where students and faculty members and administrators go to class and would go like they would pass the art on the way to a course or on our way to a meeting. So it was really interesting to see who stopped, who read the wall text. For both Slavery in the Hands of Harvard and Odolist Atlas, I chose provocative titles purposefully so people would stop and engage with the work. You can go to the next slide. So the second show of her work was focused solely on self-portraits. She uses herself as a source of inspiration. So she has a lot of like self-portraits in her practice, and these are my favorite pieces from the show. Just like different representations of her. And my favorite of the 6 is the one that's in the top and in the center, the most abstracted one. So she's just thinking about her own identity as a Black woman, as an artist, as a historian, as someone who's of a certain age in her 60s, and well, she's actually in her 70s now. So it's interesting to think of like different representations and different ways of sort of thinking about her own identity in this show. This show was actually in a dedicated art space. So yeah, you can go to the next slide. So this is on the right, you can see an installation photo. Sorry, on the left, you can see an installation photo. On the right, you can see Neal Painter with her self-portraits. Okay, you can go to the next slide. I was so happy that Neal Painter agreed to come to Harvard for some programming for the exhibition. She actually did an artist talk. And what was great about this artist talk, sorry, and I forgot to mention the title of her self-portraits exhibition. It's Freedom from Truth, Self-Portraits of Neal Painter. And that title, Freedom from Truth, comes from Old in Art School, where she talks about the difference between being a historian and being an artist. And she describes being an artist as freedom from truth. When you're a historian, you're sort of like bound by primary sources and what's in the archive and documents and texts. And she felt as an artist, she had a certain amount of freedom to sort of explore the same research questions, but using different mediums. So that was the origin of the title. But she came to Harvard and she did some programming around the exhibition. And she actually did an artist talk, and she was able to be in conversation with one of her former students, Walter Johnson, who was a historian of slavery who teaches at Harvard. So it was really nice seeing them in conversation with each other, like they've known each other for decades. I mean, he knows her as a historian and not as an artist. So it was interesting having that conversation, witnessing that conversation between them. So that's a taste of my curatorial practice, and I'd love to, talk more about it in the Q&A.
Absolutely, that was amazing. I love interrogations of archives. I love the comparison of archive and artwork, especially contemporary artwork, where you're dealing with questions that have been asked over and over and over again in many different ways over time, how these same issues kind of persist. I love that. I also love that you're curating in non-traditional art spaces sometimes. Curating here at the project spaces has been interesting because they're so liminal. They're marginal, unconventional spaces. And because they're not just that white cube, people kind of respond to them differently. So I love the idea of just jumping into that and allowing people to meet the work wherever they are or wherever you decide to put it. And so I'll ask the first question. How does your experience as an educator shape your curatorial practice?
I mean, I feel like everyone's an educator on some level. Yeah, I mean, when you're a librarian, you're an educator. Like if you're a professor or you teach high school, or, if you are a journalist, you're an educator. So, but I think my specific academic training, I think shapes the way I curate, in that I love an exhibition that has a thesis. Like I love a research question, and I want to see the presence of the curator in the exhibition. Otherwise, it's just like I'm visiting an artist studio. So I think that sort of shapes how I curate. Like, same way that I ask a student to come up with a research question or an argument or a thesis, draw an outline for an academic paper, and then sort of provide evidence that supports that thesis. I think about curation in the same way.
Yeah, I see that. And I agree. I think about that more so as a critic when I'm thinking, I've come to this space, they've put this show together. What is the argument that they're teasing out about this work? What are they really saying about the work? And how does this work transcend the canvas or the pedestal in ways that connect to questions I'm asking myself, which isn't always fair to ask. Sometimes an artist just creates, but I'm always looking for the thesis. I'm always looking for the questions, and how the artist is rising to answer them or complicate them. I love it.
And I have to say, if they're a good artist, they're prepared with something to say. It might not be the answer that you want, but they're gonna be able to talk about their work, and they're gonna have like some thesis or some argument or some way of like framing their work. Absolutely, yeah. One thing I mentioned at the beginning of my little spiel is that we're both reluctant academics and emerging curators, and I'm wondering if you had a chance to think about the relationship between academia or academic work and curatorial practice. Like for you, what is the relationship between those two things?
I think they're extremely closely tied. So I've always known my whole life that I did not want to be a teacher. Even though, as a nerdy kid, people are like, oh, you love knowledge. You want to share it with everybody. You can communicate. And it took me a long time to find libraries to say, like, there are other ways to do this besides being in a classroom. I think teaching is a vocation, and I have great respect for people who do it, especially in times like these. But I am not a teacher. I'm not made to be, at least not a traditional one. And so when I think of like curating and their close relationship with, the people who say, my mentors have said, it's university museums that are doing the most innovative, like your work, like doing the most interesting work. You're seeing that really close interrogation of archives, or that really close like intervention into art history where the scholars are, which are usually university museums. And I always consider museums like the sexy cousin of academia. Like, yeah, you know, we do the research and the archive work and create these shows, but we also get to put it, we share it differently. You know, it's more accessible and more public facing, more community based, and we work with educators and we work with artists and communities, and so I feel like it's just like it's like a further extension into public space and communities. That's what I would say. What would you say?
Yeah, you know, it's funny, when I moved to New York, and I moved to New York to start a PhD at NYU, and I had all these friends who were curators and artists, and I was looking at the work that they were doing, and I was like, well, that's kind of what I'm doing too. Except I'm writing a dissertation, you're mounting an exhibition, but both sort of involved in intellectual work. We have different ways of expressing it, like you said. So I actually think they have a lot in common. Like, curators do research, they go to archives, they write a lot. Like, it's just like two different ways of expressing our training. So I think there's a big, like a strong relationship between the two.
Absolutely. And now, you know, when I entered the program at the University of Delaware, they even said, like, we're now seriously considering alternative forms of dissertations. Have you thought about maybe mounting an exhibition? And I was like, don't tell me that, because that's what I'll do. You know, don't set me up for failure. I could give me 5 years to plan a show. Y'all watch out. Yeah. And so what curators do you take your inspiration from? Like, who do you watch? Who's your favorite?
I have to say, my favorite is Denise Morel, who mounted an exhibition at Columbia University called Posing Modernity. Yeah. And she was just a PhD student but the thesis, again, back to the thesis, but the thesis was just so strong that they made it into an exhibition, and it was so strong it was traveled to the Musée d'Orsay. I just really love the work that she did to uncover, like, the stories of these women of African descent who lived in Paris, who served as muses for these French impressionists. And up until that point, you know, no one had ever done that work. It was just really groundbreaking work. And now, of course, she's an associate curator at the Med. So, like, I stan Denise Morel. And it's that kind of work that I try to replicate in my exhibitions and also in, like, my academic writing.
You know, that's exactly who I was thinking of when I was saying what I just said. I was thinking, I wasn't able to see that show at Columbia. I did get the remnants of it at the Musée d'Orsay. And so it was like, I got the catalog in French, and I'm just so excited. And so, you know, just to see a text that thick with a Black man's body on it, it was ridiculous. She did amazing work and shook the field a little bit.
Absolutely. And I also have to say that the Columbia show was a little tighter, and the thesis was tighter. The Musée d'Orsay show was larger, and so the argument got a little, here are images of Black people from the 19th century, whereas, like, I feel like the Columbia show, like she really was able to, like, sink her hands into it.
Oh, yes. And seeing those alabaster busts, like seeing the Black body formed from alabaster, just, it's nothing like it. Absolutely nothing like it.
I also love that she, like, again, thinking about, like, what I've done in Slavery in the Hands of Harvard, she mixed archival pieces, like stuff from the 19th century, with contemporary art and put them in conversation with each other. I feel like that's a really important intervention, because you can just end up sort of replicating the values of, like, cis white male hetero patriarchy, but, like, bringing in contemporary art is like the talk back. It's the intervention. It's like, I'm not just going to show you the old stuff, but I'm going to show you how people have responded to it.
Yes. Yes. And it's just like you were asking, it's being able to show the academic process right on the street in a way that academia doesn't allow for sometimes. You know, I'm in a history program now, and even though it's interdisciplinary, we're still talking about what a traditional historical text is, what are the boundaries of that, and then who's buying it and who's your audience? Who are you writing that for? Who are you doing that for? And the conversation is so different than when we talk in curatorial spaces about who our audiences are, who we're appealing to, who we're serving, really. It's really interesting.
I'm wondering about maybe who's your favorite curator? Is it Denise Morel too?
I'm not very good at favorites because I'm flighty, I guess. I'm flighty. I don't have a favorite color. I tell people don't ask a curator their favorite color because it changes. And I would say for me, that changes all the time. I see some really, really thoughtful shows and it just blows my mind. But because of the space that I'm in right now and just being thankful for being where I am, and even in this space with you, I'm going to say it's one of my mentors. It's Dr. Brittany Webb, who's the curator of modern American art at PAFA right now. She is so thoughtful and thoughtful. Thoughtful is a term I use a lot now. And it's a word that was given to me by another mentor of mine, Dr. Teresa Brownlett Reeves here in Atlanta. And she said, is it thoughtful? And I now I can't stop using that word. And Brittany's work is just, she's also the Roden curator at PAFA. So she's doing a John Roden show, I believe in 2021. But her work is just so thoughtful and patient and critical and gentle, you know, at the same, especially when we're talking about topics of race and nationality and sexuality. Like, you don't just, it's not just throwing it out there for people to grab what they can and take from it. It's thoughtful. It's just thoughtful. So I'm gonna say Brittany Webb today. That'll change tomorrow. Feel free to ask me tomorrow. Yeah.
I'm wondering about, you know, if, you know, space or money weren't an issue, what would be your dream exhibition?
That is a really good question. And that also changes by the day because, you know, you do a studio visit and you're like, oh, I got plans for you. You know, like you're with an artist and you're just like, if I had some money and some space, we could work together. And there's two shows that I'm really interested in doing. One that I plan on it actually happening, and it's called Black in the Earth. That's the title for right now. It might change. But it's a show that interrogates the Black body's relation to the rural Earth and agriculture across the Americas. There's a photographer named Mitchell Squire who's in Iowa right now, around where I'm from. And he does these beautiful images of his body in the rural landscape of Iowa, trying to reinscribe that history of Black labor on how we see the American landscape. I love that. And I think that that's critical as so many Black communities are turning back to urban gardens, buying farms, producing their own food, self-sufficiency, to remember that that revolutionary thought is part of the reason why we're here, part of the reason why we can connect so easily back to that soil and that history. And we have that connection with our food in a way that I feel like a lot of communities don't understand. And then the other one is an exhibition based on that article I wrote, Towards a Monumental Black Body. I would love to do a show that is in a sculpture garden of commissioned monumental Black bodies from various artists, of course, like Simone Lee and Wangechi Mutu, and artists like Cosmo. Cosmo does sculptural assemblage. Like, there are so many artists who are finding innovative ways to bring power and dignity to the Black body that I want to see when I walk down the street, or that I want to see when I turn a corner, or when, you know, little kids are walking to school. I want them to see the Black body depicted in that way. When I saw Wangechi Mutu's caryatids outside the Met, I couldn't believe that they just shined in the sun like that. I haven't seen the Black body in public like that before. And so I would love to do a whole show in public space, kind of like Monument Now in New York. Yeah, what
It's
about
funny.
you?
It's funny. Both of your dream exhibitions involve the body.
Oh, I love the body. I'll the black body you to death. Like I use that all the I do. But what about you?
I have two too. I would say I'm really interested in, and this is actually inspired by Neal Painter, actually, because she's interested in beauty, in her own beauty, which is the idea behind the self-portrait show. But she has a line in Olden Art School about the pitfalls of like not being able to find pigment that accurately sort of shows her color. And so she didn't even bother. She always does something else because she doesn't go for accuracy when it comes to skin color. So I'm interested in curating an exhibition called Skin Deep, which is about how Black artists grapple with depicting skin color. And like so many artists, whether it's Kerry James Marshall or Toyin, or so many artists sort of like deal with like coloring and like Black skin in really interesting ways. So I want to do something on skin color. And also, I'm really interested in how African Americans engage with the American flag and how they change it up. And like, so I would love to curate a show where like one that uses archival images of African Americans playing with or using or showing pride in the American flag, but also how artists have like, of course, starting with like, you know, David Hammonds and like, but other ways in which African Americans have like played around with the American flag and changed the meaning of it by sometimes putting it on their own bodies, going back to the body, but also changed the coloring or like used like, you know, hair weave to make an American flag or so.
Can I ask a question? How does that play into your research as a scholar? Like, are you writing your book now? Are you publishing? How does that tie into that too? Or are they two separate things like Neal Painter?
It's interesting, Nick. I was telling you and Grace that this is actually the first time I've ever had a conversation publicly about my curatorial practice. Like it's like a different side of myself. Like I'm a fashion scholar, so most often I'm invited to speak on my research, which is on the way enslaved people sort of fought for more freedom and express their identities using fashion and dress. And that's more often what I talk about. So this is actually quite new to me, actually talking about my curatorial practice. So they're actually like, I don't have a way to talk about them in tandem or being sort of related to each other. I always think of them as just being like two sides of myself that, of course, there's some relationship because I'm interested in fashion and visual and material culture. So that's like what unites it. But in terms of like, I'm writing a book right now on enslaved people's dress, and that's not related to an exhibition in any way. So they're actually kind of separate parts of myself. I'm a two-pronged scholar, like you.
Yeah, I mean, people ask me a lot, you know, you write criticism. I critique shows. And so people ask me, you know, like, how can you do a show and then go and turn around and critique someone else's show? But I think that it's all part of the same ecosystem. The ideas, the questions, the nurturing of artists, it works from all sides. If you're not cruel, you know, if you're not harsh or self-motivated, your criticism is just an extension of me wanting to give an artist space. Every time I interview an artist, it's because that artist has said something that I want to share with other people, that I feel like they need that platform to share with other people. And I don't know, I feel like I can't help but make everything about the same thing. There's so many moments where I'm in class where I'm like, and I was just thinking about that, and I was just thinking about this, and I just talked to an artist about this, and thinking like how these are all going to become shows. It's hard for me to fully invest in school by itself. I'm mining the resources. It's about to be, I'm planning on leaving with a folder of proposals for exhibitions, if not my dissertation exhibition. Just because it's rich. Even your work is rich. And I didn't even know I was following you on Instagram until we got this amazing opportunity. I had looked through, you know, Fashioning the Self, that image of that Du Bois photograph from the 1900 Paris exhibition. And just, it's so interesting how worlds just kind of intertwine and interconnect, and random things just happen. So how did you become a curator then? You mentioned you had a lot of curator artist friends. Is that how it started, or?
Yeah, basically it happened organically. Like, and there was never a moment where I decided that, I'm going to be a curator. Like, it just happened through, like, in like, even in the Slavery in the Hands of Harvard show, like, many of those artists were my friends. So when, like, I applied for a grant at Harvard, and I was like, it was a grant for sort of faculty development. You could use it to, like, do research. You can do it to curate an exhibition. You can do it to, like, buy books for your library. And I was like, what can I use this money for? The money's being offered to me. Like, what can I do with this money? And I was like, I should curate an exhibition. Like, I've seen so many of my friends do it, and I have all these friends that are artists. Like, let me throw my hat into the ring, and it worked out. Yeah. So now I'm identifying as a curator. But if you would have talked to me 5 or 6 years ago, I would have said I was a writer, and I'm still a writer and a historian. But now I'm also calling myself a curator.
Yes. Can you talk more about how you'll take that? Like, where are you going to go with it?
Yeah, I mean, we'll see. I'm guest curating an exhibition at the Winterthur, in your neck of the woods, actually.
Yeah. Oh, please.
Yeah, that's in 2024. So, we'll see. But yeah, that's my next curatorial project. And you mentioned that you also have an exhibition coming up that opens in February, right?
Yes. It's the project spaces for the Atlanta Biennial. And that I took on as an independent. Moving from this fellowship to being a student now means I'm an independent curator. And I'm going to try to keep curating and keep working while I'm in school. But it's harder to find spaces while also being a full-time student, while also in the archives and in the library. This project has been a smooth transition because they found me. But after this project, I'm going to be searching for spaces so I can start materializing some of these shows and answering more of the questions that I have, And also, I'm new to Philly. Like, I have to start doing studio visits and meeting these artists and finding my art community there. So it's a lot of investment work I have to do once this virus stops, virusing.
Philly has such a rich art scene. So, I mean, there's a lot of potential. Yeah.
Yes. And so many institutions too.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you do that's different than other curators do? Would you say, do you do anything unconventional, or is there someplace you'd like to see the field go?
What do I do that's unconventional? Well, I think one thing is, like, for the Slavery in the Hands of Harvard show, like I said, a lot of those artists were people that I'd already, like, the only artist that I had never met in person was Rosana Paulino, who's the Brazilian artist. All the other artists, and Carol Walker, but all the other artists were artists that I've known and interacted with in the past, or I invited for a conference, or had done an artist talk for me. So I think in some way that might be unconventional, that I already had a working relationship with a lot of the artists. I also included one of my own works in the Slavery in the Harvard show, which I didn't include in the presentation, but I actually created a work. What? I'm not an artist. I'm not willing to.
You're an exhibiting artist.
I'm not willing to call myself an artist, not to, like, disrespect, my artist friends who are actually professional artists. But I was thinking about my own relationship to universities, and, like, my own fraught, like, relationship to Harvard and other universities that I had attended. And I took my actual diplomas, and I painted over them. Oh, wow. And I included it in the show. And people actually said, like, are these your actual diplomas? Like, yeah, they were my actual diplomas. So I think that's unconventional. Like, I included my own work into a show that I was curating.
Yes, and that's the kind of material culture work I love. That's an object that has social meaning, personal meaning, cultural meaning, cachet. Like, that is so interesting. What did you paint over them?
I did a triptych. So I used all 3 of my diplomas. And one of them had the I'm a Man sign painted over it. And then another one had the continent of Africa painted over it. And then the third one had two hands that were chained, breaking free, painted over it. And I changed the direction so that it wasn't like a landscape. I flipped it and made it into a portrait orientation. So
yes, I love it. I love that you're at Harvard. You know, that legacy of Du Bois, that legacy of Alain Locke, like just keep adding to the list. Brilliant Black men doing brilliant things, busting that institution up.
Exactly. Yeah, I think, one of my favorite scholars, an artist actually, is Fred Moten. And he has this idea of the undercommons and like using universities and actually to a certain extent stealing from universities when it's and like doing the work that you want to do and using the resources and the spaces of the university to do actual like radical work. And I always think about that in terms of my exhibitions too.
Yes.
Do you have any unconventional practices or methodologies that you?
At this point, no. I feel like I keep commissioning work, which I feel like I would love to keep doing. I don't know, I doubt I could build a whole curatorial practice around that, but I would love to keep working kind of like side by side with artists to interrogate like societal questions. That process was a lot of fun for me. Sephora was a very gracious artist, very giving, and that she showed me, like I spent a lot of time with her, in her studio, on the street, going through material, interviewing her. It's the same with Cosmo. I think I interviewed him he's probably tired of me. I interviewed him so many times, asking him very similar questions with like minute differences. And I like to spend a lot of time with the artists that I work with. And I'm thankful I get to be here in Atlanta now. I'm spending time with the artists I'm working with in February. But I don't think that's unconventional. I think that's something that a lot of curators who have trained me and have shown me how they do this work, I think that's how they work. And as someone who's not an art historian, like all of my sources are primary. I'm working directly with living artists and asking them how they do and why they do what they do.
And I also think the best shows come out of conversations. Like, the artist should have a say what's included in the show, whether it's that they're commissioning work for the show or they have a say in the works that are chosen for the show. There might be another controversial or unconventional way of thinking about a show, but I really think like the best exhibitions come out of a conversation between the curator and the artist.
Yeah, and building that relationship, trusting each other with each other's work, especially when you're commissioning, like I'm trusting that artist to deliver. They're trusting me to represent them well. They're trusting me to put them in a strong conversation. It's definitely an ecosystem, but I would prefer like community work. Like I'm hoping that I'm building a community around myself with these artists, with these other artwork. There's so many amazing curators I'm meeting in this cohort I'm in with the studio emerging just like me. I have a colleague at Delaware, Tyra Seals, who's emerging with me. There's a whole generation of curators who I want to know and I want to be in conversation with and dialogue with, and maybe we work together, maybe we share spaces, maybe we warn each other about spaces. It's definitely community work for me. Yeah.
So along that line, how would you say your relationships with other curators are your relationships with, the artists that you mentioned, like Cosmo White? How does that shape your practice?
It makes everything extremely personal. I think and that's just me. I'm like long-winded and sentimental. Like everything is the political is personal. Is that it? The personal is political. Like I 100% believe that. I give a lot of myself to my work. And I gave my first lecture at the Flatton Museum, and I ended it with a picture of my mom and myself and talked about how my relationship with my mother and the mothers of my family. I talk about an infinite mother, an infinite motherly being that sometimes has my mother's face, sometimes has my grandma's face, sometimes has my great-grandmother's face. How that moves beyond the physical body and into a spiritual connection or understanding of what a mother is. But so it's just personal. It's just personal, and I care for these artists, and we work together, and you make sure they eat, and you make sure they sleep, and you make sure they put the work down when they need to put the work down. And I feel like they give me energy and they give me life and they give me new ways to have the same conversations I want to have with my communities, which is answering these questions, interrogating these questions, throwing away questions, you know. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's the beauty of being an emerging curator, because you have that opportunity. If you're like at an institution, like there's so many other demands that are placed on you that are more administrative, that you can't really maintain that kind of relationship with a lot of artists. So I think that's the beauty and the power of being an emerging curator, and that's something I never want to sort of lose. So yeah, like I mean, I think of a show or an exhibition as being a conversation opener and not a conversation closer, if that makes sense. And I know that contradicts what I was saying about me loving exhibitions that have a research question and provide evidence for that research question. But at the same time, I think on top of doing that, I love it when you can sort of, there's a takeaway, or there's points to ponder, or, you know. So I think you can only get that when you have a conversation with an artist, because if you're sort of looking through their oeuvre or their catalog online and you just sort of pluck a piece out that you think it works, like there's only so much that you can say or do with that. But when you have a conversation with the artist, like you can sort of shape more the way the viewer sort of views the show and the questions that are asked and the conclusions that you come to. So I think it makes for a more rich, more robust, more dynamic show.
Yeah, and that speaks to discourse and scholarship too. Like, you put out a piece and scholars comment on it, they contribute to it, generations of scholars build on it or problematize it, you know, or throw it away. I think it's absolutely beautiful and speaks to you as a thinker. So I'm glad to know you too, you know, like part of that community building, right?
Exactly.
Hey.
Muted. Hi guys. Cat, thanks for putting me back in. I've literally been a fly on the wall, listening in the background, and I wanted to share with you all that I am also part of the Denise Morel fan club. In fact, I might fight you for the head of the fan club. And I'm teaching a class now called Case Studies in Curatorial Activism, and her Posing Modernity is one of our major case studies for the course. And she was so gracious to spend some time with my students as a guest speaker. And just in addition to being a brilliant mind and a brilliant art historian, just the nicest human being, and incredibly generous with her time. And I think she would like me to tell the audience that the Met has, where she is now, where she's posted now, the Met has currently opened some incredible internships and fellowships. And Denise is very, very enthusiastic about curators of color applying for those opportunities. So go to the Met museum.org, I believe, and you will see those opportunities. It's just been so lovely to listen to both of you and your stories. And one of the things to the audience that we were talking about before we went live was both the absence and presence of Black male curators in the field. And I know both of you feel that there's room for growth there, for more Black male curators to be in this community. And so I wanted to ask you, what is that experience like for you to often be one of the few Black male curators, emerging or established, working in our field?
Yeah, I'm sure you can identify with this, TK, but I feel like every time that I walk into an art space, I'm making an intervention. Like it's like it's a transgressive act for a Black man to walk into a gallery, and people want to they look at you and they want to sort of place you in like certain categories. And, you know, they want to make you into like, you know, a staff member or a docent or, you know, even an artist. And, you know, I'm not any of those things. I'm a scholar and an emerging curator. So yeah, like it's, you know, I really don't have much to say beyond that. Like it's you know, we were talking about this before the conversation, like the public conversation, you know, we were scratching our heads trying to think of Black male curators, and we could only think of 3 or 4 just off the top of the head, even though I'm sure there's a little more than that, but I think it does. I mean, it's a damn shame. Like, I don't know what else to say.
I had a really hard time. A colleague reached out to me, a Black woman who is an art worker, reached out to me and said, "Hey, TK, can you tell me some other Black male emerging curators like yourself? We're thinking about putting together a program." I was like, "I don't know, girl. Like, I honestly, you know, I have a colleague in Philadelphia. His name is Tyler Shine, who's an art historian. Farron Manuel is well known in Atlanta here, but it was very hard. I had to sit there and I had to text people and say, like, do you know any, you know, and half of me is like, well, are we needed, you know, in this space? Because Black women are they're doing great work. But I feel like in terms of the possibility of this as a position for Black men, the possibility of this the possibility of being a scholar as a Black man is something that is still needed. That representation is still needed. And who knows what'll happen when there are more Black men in the conversation, what'll happen to the same works that we've seen, just from different walks of life.
And it's funny.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Jonathan.
Oh, sorry. I was thinking, like, you know, we were saying that, you know, we're marginal within the marginalized, or we're minorities within the minorities. But then when you add like the lens of queerness, for me at least, it's like I'm marginal within the marginal within the marginal. So there's several layers of marginality.
This is really it's tough to hear. It's really hard to hear, and I know you all know that the Caribbean Cultural Center has this curatorial fellowship that we were supposed to launch this year over the summer, but we all know everything got canceled. But we're working to relaunch it next year, and it's entirely devoted to curators of color. And I'm curious, what, as in your positions as Black males in the field, what do you think needs to happen in order to create that greater pipeline for more Black male curators to be your colleagues and to be in community and collaboration with you? Because, and I asked that, TK, just based on the story you were just sharing about the question you were asked. Oftentimes I think institutions are the ones prescribing, oh, let's do this, let's do this, let's do this. But we're not necessarily asking the very people who the programs are meant for, what is it that they want and what is it that they think is going to be a solution or a remedy or a mitigation for the absence.
I think that I have a hard time with questions like these because, you know, I'm going to be broke for the rest of my life. Like, I'm not jumping around telling people like, oh, you can make so much money and it's so wonderful to, you know, I consider myself a civil servant, and I always compare myself to like a trash man or a postal worker. I give myself to my communities, and I'm building a new community in Philadelphia, and I'll be giving myself to that community. And there's no guarantee of money or security or respect. You know, even as a scholar, just as a scholar, not everybody respects what you do. And I think that it's a hard field to get into. One, it's hard to break into. There's not a lot of Dr. Marita Pools out there. And for all the ones that are out there, they might not have the resources. You know, she applied for a grant with the Ford and the Walton Foundation and got it through the Domley Initiative. But think of all the curators out there who didn't get it, who weren't able to create that space for people like me. And so it's hard. It's not easy work to do, and it's a lot of people work. You have to really work with people in your mind for your ideas and your thoughts and your emotions, and not paid well for it. And so I think that you know, it's just people who love art and love scholarship, finding this field, finding their viability, and us, the three of us even, creating spaces where they can see a future in this, and security in this, and support is my cheap answer for the day.
I would definitely echo that. Yeah, and I would also add that, you know, I would have to agree with you and say that, you know, I ask myself the same question, like, should there even be space for Black male curators? Because the Black female curators are killing the game. And even if there is space for Black male curators, I also never want to lose sort of my Black feminist lens. You know, most of the artists that I work with are Black and are female. So, and also queer. So I feel like, I don't know, I wonder, I do think there should be more space for Black male curators, but also I don't want to lose sort of, I don't think there should be a focus on Black hetero cisness in the process of doing it. I always want to come in as a Black male, Black cis male, and also bring in feminism and queerness and all those other things that are important to me.
And if I could add something real quick, I also want to acknowledge all of the Black male artists who do curatorial work, because, you know, the art world is weird in that it works on all these multiple levels and all these different spaces. And even here in Atlanta, like, there's like a club art scene and like that traditional like Walker scene and the high, and then all these other art spaces. Like, there are people working on multiple levels. And in some of those levels, there's Black men who are the teacher, the curator, the artist, the programmer, you know, the director. They're doing all of those things in one, but maybe they're just known for being an artist. So I want to acknowledge those men and women and queer people who are out there doing it all, because there's a lot of y'all out there too that don't get the recognition that you deserve.
I want to share with both of you, you're getting some lovely compliments. We love compliments. Right? Alicia Martinez, thank you for sending your comment that she's saying it's wonderful, and congratulations to both of you for your important work. And Nina Olson is on Facebook, and she would like to thank you both for a thoughtful and thought-provoking conversation. And Jonathan, quickly, there was just a follow-up. And Paul wants to know, when you were talking about slavery in the hands of Harvard, where they can find, I don't know if it's public in Harvard's archive, but where they can find the information for the student paying their tuition with sugar. Is that publicly available? Does one need to be physically in the archives to access it?
It is publicly available. I often get questions about research process, and I love talking about research process in writing. But most of my sources are actually digitized and available online, so it is available online. There's a database that's part of Harvard library system, and I don't know the catalog number or the title of the document, but it is accessible. And if that person reaches out to me, then I can forward them the database that I found that document on.
Wonderful. Do you want to give them your website quickly so they can find your contact info? Just tell them, it's Jonathan. Is it jonathansquare.com? Is that
exactly? Perfect.
There you go. So I love hearing about different curators' sort of pedagogy of your practice, and I picked up on something quite interesting between the two of you. So Jonathan, you, and I wrote this down because it's so fascinating, you said, I want to see the presence of the curator in the exhibition. And TK, later on, when Jonathan asked you who were some of your favorite curators, in addition to the Denise Morel fan club, you were sharing a story of another curator, and you used the word gentleness, and you said something along the lines of, I appreciate the gentleness in the curator's imprint in the project. And so we have these two very interesting polls, right? Jonathan, you saying, I want to see the curator's hand. and presence in the exhibition, and TK, you applauding the gentleness, the curator's gentleness and their imprint in the project. So I was wondering if we can bring those two things together and talk more about these sort of different curatorial visions of curating.
You want me to?
Go ahead, TK.
I think what I mean by that is that a lot of the time, especially with people of color, especially with marginal identities, queer people, immigrants, we're talking about not just things that are real, but can be real harsh and real traumatic and real painful and triggering. And these conversations are important and essential to have and share and to create spaces for. But at the same time, academic speech is not gentle. It's not kind. It can be, you can form it and it's moldable, but at the same time, it's harsh. And, it's just like the difference between, I've been in an archive and somebody's been saying blacks, like throughout the labeling of Black people. And it's like, you could have added a people at the end of that. You could have acknowledged that these are human beings. And I think with Brittany Webb specifically, like, she's thinking of people first, and then thinking about their experiences and how to share that experience while acknowledging that that person is still a person. She's co-curating a show at PAFA that opens in a couple of weeks called Taking Space, about women working in monumental scale in taking up a space, women of all races, ethnicities, nationalities, taking up space. And she's centering that these women are people first, not necessarily that they're women or feminine. You know what I mean? Like, they're a person and they're human and they're expressing experiences that they've had living in a woman's body, being feminine. I got a lot to say about that because I saw a presentation recently and they just killed it. Just killed it. And so that's what I mean. It's recognizing that we are appealing to people, actual people, showing the expressions of real people, and that curatorial clutch that's on it. It's not necessarily about you, it's about being a conduit. Are you able to relay that information, relay that emotion, relay that history even, in a way that makes it real, but also understandable and consumable and accessible to people?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. And, when I said that, I want to see the presence of the curator, I would edit that and say I want to see the gentle presence of the curator.
I love that.
But one of my pet peeves is weak shows. There just feels like someone just went into an artist studio and plucked a handful of works and threw it on the wall, and there's really no thought process behind it. There's no argument. There's no curation, really. So that's what I meant when I said that I want to see the presence of the curator. I want to see that this isn't just a handful of work by an artist. Like, I chose these works for a reason, and this is my reason for doing that. But yeah, I would say that, there should be a certain level of thoughtfulness and gentleness in doing so.
We've got a question coming in that will get you both in trouble. So that's exactly why I'm asking it, because good trouble is good. And Paul is asking to both of you, what emerging artists are catching your attention both in the U.S. and abroad?
Oh, wow.
You want an emerging artist?
Yes, emerging. Mm-hmm.
Oh, there's so many, y'all. Like, that's not even fair.
That's what I said. It's a question to get you in trouble. Because TK, you were sharing earlier the questions you don't ask a curator. What's your favorite color? This is also one of the questions you don't ask some artists that are your favorites. So it's bound to get you in lots of trouble.
But I do have an answer, and it's another deep answer for y'all. But it's the artists I'm working with. The show that I'm curating now, I've left Atlanta. I've been out of Atlanta for 5-6 months now. These are artists that stayed on my mind. Mm-hmm. Artists that are, and they're interdisciplinary and they're all interested in the archive. But beyond that, just talking to them, seeing them around Atlanta, seeing their work, hearing about them in the discourse, like these are artists who all stuck with me and are experimenting in their own practice, but also in the way that we understand art outside of commodification. And so it's like Shane and Danielle. Danielle does everything. She, like I said, she's a dancer, she's an actress, she's a mother, she's all of these things, and she's a durational performance artist. She's gonna get out here and perform for hours in February outside. Like the way that she's giving her body to this performance to illuminate the histories of Black women who worked on the railroads here astounds. And that's the any artist I work with astounds me. I can guarantee that. And so if you want that answer, it'll continuously change, but you just have to follow my career.
Yeah, I agree with TK. Like it's my answer changes every day. Right now, I'm going to say Elizabeth Columba, who's actually has a work that's in the show that you referenced at PAFA, taking space.
Yes.
But I love Elizabeth Columba, how she takes, she was born in France, trained in France, but she also, foregrounds Black women. So you see sort of like Dutch masters kind of work, but the subject topic is like Black women. So I love Elizabeth Columba. I also have a project right now, a new digital humanities project called Rendering Revolution, which is all about sartorial and artistic representations of the Haitian Revolution. So there are a number of Haitian and Haitian American artists that I'm like obsessed with right now, like Fabiola Jean-Louis, who I stan, in Joanne Petit-Frere, another artist that I love. And I can just give you a list of like Haitian and Haitian American artists that are sort of like on my radar right now.
Mm-hmm. My final question to both of you, TK, you shared, just thinking about your presence in the world and your body in the world, you shared that there are moments where you also feel a kind of migrant-ish, and I understand that very personally because I am an immigrant in this country. And so for both of you, I'm wondering, when you wear these roles of curator, does the role and the curatorial community, does that ameliorate that sense of migrant-ishness a little bit, somewhat, or not at all? And then Jonathan, I don't mean to presume that you share that migrant-ish-esque feeling, but if you do or don't, I'd love to hear, how, if and how you feel a sense of community when we're in these roles of curator.
That's a really beautiful question. Yeah. And I was struck by that statement by TK too. I feel like one of the defining characteristics of the African diaspora is that constant search for home, that sort of placelessness, to make up a word. And sort of, I think most people of African descent probably spend their entire lives sort of working through, grappling with that sort of placelessness, that looking for a home, like being of a place, but not being, I'm using Du Bois. I'm paraphrasing Du Bois now, but being of a place, but not being part of that place in some way. So yeah, I do think that's just a constant sort of undertone of being Black or being a migrant. You just sort of that tension, that sort of double consciousness of, being of two places or being of multiple places.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I feel like it's a two-sided coin. You feel like regardless of where this body ends up, I can put down roots somewhere. I will, that great migration, I'm going to survive, or that I have people everywhere, that confidence that you have and understanding that your people have been moving around this earth for centuries. And there is someone you can connect to, whether it's subconscious or conscious, around the world, is comforting, but it's also extremely isolating because Blackness is vast. And so it's it comes in all creeds, colors, shapes, expressions. And in that vastness, it can sometimes feel like your Black expression is the only Black expression that there is, and it's always being demeaned or disrespected or oppressed, and it's hard to be out there being vulnerable and being yourself and being a whole person when you show up to different spaces constantly. But for anybody who feels like that, I hope you know that your Blackness is beautiful, and share that with other. Even within the diaspora, there's so much diversity. I feel like we have to continue to remind each other that we are of each other, and we have so much to share and give each other, that it makes my job feel like a conduit. Like, I feel like I'm always like, have you seen this African retention in this? Or have you seen this in this? Or and it's really not really anything to do with race or gender or sexuality. It's really about being human. I feel like my job is reminding people that they're human beings, and that how vulnerable and sentient our bodies are. They're vulnerable, and we share in that. I don't know. That could get real deep and sentimental about but yeah.
Well, maybe that's the next essay. Maybe it's a co-authored Curators in Conversation brought you together, co-authored essay.
I'm down.
On that note of curatorial conduits, thank you both so much for being here, for letting me randomly put you together, and see the magic that happens. I think magic happened. It was just so wonderful to listen to both of you, to see your work, but also hear the way you think about your roles and your positions in this field. And I just want to thank you so much. You're forever part of the CCCADI curatorial family. We'll be circling back to you for more things from here on out. And I'll leave you to say the final word.
Well, I just want to express gratitude. This has been a very special moment. So thank you for this opportunity for me to share my work and talk a little bit about my practice. Like I said, this is the first time I ever talked about curating publicly before. So thank you for this opportunity, and thank you, TK, for being, a wonderful discussant, as it were.
And I'll echo that. Thank you both so much. It's been wonderful.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kat, our magician behind the scenes, and good night, everybody. We will see you next month for the next Curators in Conversation. Good night, everyone.
Good night.